Well, hello everyone. I first of all want to thank Jose for inviting me to present at this conference. And I have to say that I'm really sorry and sad that I can't actually be there, and indeed that none of us can be there. So hopefully it'll happen again in the future. In memory of the last time we met, I'm wearing my Valparaiso t-shirt, and perhaps you can see up there, there's a memento from my visit to the Neruda house. So Latin America remains very much in my heart, and hopefully I'll be able to visit again soon, and also hopefully you'll be able to visit Australia one day as well. I'm recording my paper because the time zones they don't really line up so easily. Obviously that'll make it a little bit difficult for you to ask me questions, but feel free to email me those questions or catch me on Facebook or whatever. I'd be more than happy to take those questions. Okay, so the paper that I'm presenting is an extract from my book, Assemblage Theory and Method, which I hope all of you have seen, or at least you're aware of, and hopefully someone is going to translate into Spanish, from chapter 3 on territory. So the key to understanding the concept of territory is chaos, defined as an existential condition rather than a physical state of affairs, though obviously it can be that too. And this is effectively ground zero for schizoanalysis and pretty much for everything that Deleuze and Guattari do. And we can see this very clearly in the chapter on the refrain in 1,000 Plateaus, which, despite its title, is really about the concept of territory. In a nice turn of phrase, Elizabeth Gross defines the refrain as, and I'm quoting, a kind of rhythmic regularity that brings a minimum of livable order to a situation in which chaos beckons. Now, unfortunately, Gross does not expand on the phrase livable order herself, but in what follows, I will try to expand upon it for you as a way of understanding the notion of territory. So territory, I want to say, is a livable order produced and sustained by a refrain. For Deleuze and Guattari, chaos is an ever-present potentiality in both our mental lives and the physical world. All that we have and all that we are, even the most stratified aspects of our lives, is nothing but a temporary victory over the relentless forces of chaos, which are like a ground base to our very existence. Now, Deleuze and Guattari conceive chaos as both the absolute foundation for all thinking, it is the beginning and literally the end of thought, and as a kind of relative dissolution of the senses and the sensible. It is, in other words, an ever-present possibility, but one that is only realized in certain circumstances, but it is never far away, can never be entirely forgotten or ignored. Deleuze and Guattari speak of chaos as threatening, stalking, and trying to reabsorb the hard-won sensibility of the concept. But even though they often speak of chaos as something to fear and to ward off, to defend against, they are equally adamant that without it, without at least a little bit of it, we would stultify and die. So chaos in this sense is both life and death. In What is Philosophy, a book that is essentially organized around the notion of chaos, Deleuze and Guattari depict the disciplines of art, philosophy, and science as being in a battle against chaos. And really that's how the whole book is organized. It's really how do these three forms of thought, if you like, defend against chaos and at the same time make use of chaos. The aim of these battles against chaos is never to win completely, never to absolutely get rid of chaos, to shut out chaos altogether, because to do that would be to create a form of death in life. So in other words, there is a kind of art of dosages when it comes to chaos. One needs chaos, but only so much and never too much, just enough to disrupt normal service, so to speak, and allow creativity to flow. But as they often caution, one should not deterritorialize, i.e. let chaos in, too quickly and never completely, one needs to hold on to just enough territory to rebuild a life. The danger of chaos is that it is attractive to us under certain circumstances, and if we fall too deeply into it, we may never escape it. This is why Deleuze and Guattari also refer to chaos as a black hole. It captures you and does not let you out. Far from being a blank, undifferentiated morass, chaos has its own, and I'm quoting here again, its own directional components, which are its ecstasies. So the black hole does not pre-exist our actions, rather it is the product of our actions. It is, as Deleuze and Guattari put it, a machine effect in assemblages. Everything we do, insofar as it is an action of desire, carries the risk of plunging us into a black hole. In this sense, territory should be understood as a defensive concept because it describes our means of getting out of black holes we sometimes find ourselves in, either because we chose to go down a dark path or somehow our actions inadvertently led us there. Our life then isn't a state of affairs, it is rather an intermeshing of multiple territories, some that are positive, some that are negative, some that bring joy, some that bring sadness. Deterritorialization, which is the process of leaving the territorial fortress of the I, as Lacan puts it, which defends against the despair of the potential black holes populating our existence, is thus highly dangerous, as Deleuze and Guattari frequently remind us. In the fullest sense, deterritorialization means functioning without territory, free falling into chaos without a safety net or harness, which is why whenever we deterritorialize, we immediately seek opportunities to re-territorialize. And if you wanted a soundtrack here at this point, then I recommend playing Tom Petty's song, Free Falling. So much so that we effectively only deterritorialize in order to re-territorialize, which is what happens when we change our minds or we fall in love. We leave one territory so that we can immediately enter into another. Deleuze and Guattari stipulate that there are three forms of deterritorialization, three ways of leaving our territory, or what they also call lines of flight. A line of flight is the path of a particular deterritorialization. Negative, relative, and absolute are the three forms. The negative deterritorialization is one that is overlaid by re-territorialization, which amounts to saying it is a form of change one undergoes in order to remain the same. The relative deterritorialization overcomes the inertia of re-territorialization, but can do so only in an ad hoc way, which means it never entirely escapes re-territorialization and sometimes ends up in a black hole as well. Deterritorialization is absolute when it succeeds in creating a new earth, as Deleuze and Guattari put it, by which they mean a new beginning, one that does not lead back to old territories. But just as this is the higher path, as it were, it is also the more dangerous, because one form of absolute escape is, of course, death, and the other is madness. Following Nietzsche and Castaneda, Deleuze and Guattari identify a variety of dangers associated with each species of line of flight. The short list of the most important dangers include fear, clarity, power, and disgust. We fear losing our security, all the comforts we have grown accustomed to, which define the very order of things, or the order of our lives, if you like. We retreat in the face of the unknown, harden ourselves against the call to change. We speak of the old days and call for a return to the way things were, the fantasy of lost certainties. Clarity is the feeling of knowing everything, of seeing through everything, of not being taken in by anything. Instead of the great paranoias generated by fear, we have a multitude of micro-paranoias, which are every bit as damaging, of seeing threats in even the smallest details. Think here of the thousands of people at Trump rallies happening in the US right now or recently, shouting, lock her up or send them back or build a wall or whatever insane thing they're shouting now. Power moves between these 2 points of view, fear and clarity. And as Deleuze and Guattari put it, every man of power jumps from one line to the other, alternating between a petty and lofty style, the rogue style and the grandiloquent style, drugstore demagoguery and the imperialism of the high-ranking government man, which sounds exactly like Trump, right? He wants to stop the lines of flight that elude his control, but can only do so by creating a void. The fourth danger, the great disgust, is in many ways the most important. Here they invoke Fitzgerald, specifically his famous line that his self-immolation was something sodden dark, as a prelude to asking, and quoting Deleuze here, why is the line of flight a war one risks coming back from, defeated, destroyed, after having destroyed everything one could? Why, in other words, does the attempt to escape from a black hole only increase the power of that black hole? Why, instead of a way out, does the line of flight turn out to be a way down? For Deleuze and Guattari, it is only by recognizing the strange power of attraction of this particular line of flight, the way down, if you like, replete with its dangers, that we can begin to understand fascism. And it's kind of sad to say that some 40 years after they published 1,000 Plateaus, the problem of the attractions of fascism remain with us just as strongly as they were in the 1980s. So fascism, they say, is a suicidal rather than a totalitarian form of government or form of governing, if you like, an idea that they take from Virilio. Suicide, they say, is presented not as a punishment, but rather as the crowning glory of the death of others. This is why the people cheered Hitler, they argue, because they wanted that death through the death of others. And as Deleuze and Guattari argued in Anti-Oedipus, there is no false consciousness or deception here. At a certain point, they say, under a certain set of conditions, people wanted fascism, and it is the perversion of the desire of the masses that needs to be accounted for. And I guess what I'm saying is that problem remains. We still need to try to understand the perversion of the desire of the masses, whether it's people voting for Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Brexit in the UK, or the kind of insane anti-climate change people that we have in Australia. The line of flight toward abolition and the black hole it terminates in should not be compared or equated to with the death drive. There are no internal drives in desire, only assemblages. Desire is always assembled. It is what the assemblage determines it to be. The assemblage that draws lines of flight is on the same level as they are and is of the war machine type. In other words, what we call fascism is immanent to the assemblage, i.e., it is generated by the assemblage and not the unleashing of primeval instincts for violence and death. As such, it may be better to speak of the desire called fascism, to borrow a phrase from Lyotard. The question at hand is, how is it possible for the ordinary seeming assemblages of everyday life, such as prevailed in Germany in the 1930s, could send an entire nation along the suicidal line of flight that precipitated World War II and all the ensuing horrors? Unfortunately, Deleuze and Guattari only hint at an answer to this question, but their speculation, which they also take from Virilio, is that the manifold miseries of daily life, i.e. clarity, snowball into a longing for a clean break. Now, exit polls following both Brexit and Trump's 2016 election pointed to exactly this type of desire. People wanted change. They wanted disruption for a million different reasons. And so they voted for the disruptors, regardless of whether they believed it would be a change for the better. And as we wait for the results of the current US election, many of these same questions remain. And I imagine that the diagnosis remains the same. There's people who want change, even if they don't know what that change will bring. So many commentators have speculated whether this turn of events constitutes the appearance of a new stage of fascism. Whether or not Trump is a fascist is the subject of considerable debate amongst leftist commentators, without anyone being able to decide one way or another. In large part, this is because the historical comparisons don't really stack up. Trump's regime has neither been as murderous as Hitler's nor as ideologically uniting. Hitler's popularity at the start of his reign greatly exceeds Trump's, even amongst his most ardent supporters. And Hitler was also obviously in favor of war, which Trump, to his small credit, I have to say, does not seem to be. Indeed, in his early campaigning in 2015, he spoke against America's invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, describing it as self-defeating. Umberto Eco's proposition that every age has its own fascism, which the US critic Lawrence Grossberg cites approvingly, is, I think, very useful here because it sets aside the tedious problem of historical comparison and allows us to focus instead on the new ways in which the love of power manifests itself. But in contrast to Grossberg, who argues that American fascism is defined by its reconfiguration of the nation state, I want to suggest instead that it is defined in terms of its particularity of a line of flight towards death. Now, one could point to a variety of examples to evidence this, but the starkest illustration of this line of flight towards death that I have seen, and I use it precisely because it is so banal and also seems so benign, is Disney's appropriation and transformation of Star Wars characters into theme park attractions. So in 2017, a couple of days before the Trump inauguration, I was in the US and I took my kids to that most American of places, Walt Disney World in Orlando. So this was early 2017, 5 years after Disney purchased Lucasfilm and 2 years before the dedicated Star Wars section of the park, Galaxy's Edge, opened. So we got to see the earthworks for what Galaxy Edge was going to be, and it was quite enormous. At the time then, there were a couple of makeshift Star Wars themed areas and rides and so forth. So, Star Wars had a presence in the park, but it was not yet a big presence. However, every hour or so, the familiar refrain, dun, 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 of the Emperor's March, which we all know from our childhood, would suddenly blast from all the loudspeakers all over the park. And then all of a sudden, a platoon of stormtroopers led by Captain Phasma would assemble in the main squares. This is, the famous Main Square USA, and then they would march down the very famous Main Street USA. And I remember being really surprised by this because intuitively one would expect in a place like Disneyland, the happiest place on earth and everything, that instead of, seeing stormtroopers march around, you would see rebels. You'd see the good guys, not the bad guys. And everywhere else in the park, they always celebrate the good guys. And yet at every turn, we were far more likely to see representatives of the dark side, from the ubiquitous stormtroopers to Darth Vader and Kylo Ren, than we were to see the heroes of the good side, such as Luke Skywalker or Princess Leia. Now, this was true even in the many merchandise outlets where Darth Vader and Stormtrooper were easily the most frequently represented characters on t-shirts, coffee mugs, and backpacks. As surprised as I was to see the prominence given to Stormtroopers and Darth Vader in the happiest place on earth, the more I thought about it, the more fitting it seemed. Maybe it was because the Trump inauguration was only a few days away, but I couldn't help but think that in a country like the US, which in many ways is the most powerful imperial nation in history, it is apt that the dark side of the Force should be so attractive to so many people. And obviously not just to Americans, because millions of tourists like me go to Disney theme parks every year as well. And it seemed to me to be living proof that black holes do indeed have their own directional components, which are its ecstasies. It is not the ecstasy of some vague evil, however. The appeal is, I think, quite specific. The appeal of stormtroopers is the appeal of planet destroyers. It is doubtless no accident that the central plot of every Star Wars movie has been to save entire planets from literal obliteration. The Death Star in all its incarnation is the ultimate black hole. It not only brings death, it invites us to marvel at its power, to feel its libidinal tractor beam, and recognize it as the embodiment of everything that we fear and desire, death as life. The environment has always paid the price of human advancement, but it is only in the last few decades that humanity has become collectively conscious of the fact that our actions are pushing the planet in a direction that will no longer support life as we know it. To continue to profit from the destruction of the planet and to facilitate that destruction, as Trump is doing by rolling back environmental legislation designed to protect what remains, can only be called environmental profiteering. As is the case with war profiteering, environmental profiteering takes advantage of a crisis for the sake of making money and resists all efforts to end the crisis because that would put an end to its profits. This is our situation now. The technology exists to switch most of our energy needs to renewable sources, but governments and corporations everywhere resist this because it would spell the end of a multi-billion-dollar industry. Therefore, the strange attraction Trump exerts on a small but sufficient percentage of American voters is literally a line of abolition, because the failure to arrest global warming will jeopardize the lives of all living creatures on Earth, not just humans. The fact that multi-billionaires like America's CEO, Amazon CEO, although it could be CEO of America too, Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos are fantasizing about colonizing Mars as Rhodes once did, is of a piece with this line of abolition because it embraces and actively seeks to profit from the end of the world as we know it. So to kind of bring this to some kind of a conclusion and focus on the conceptual point that I want to make here, I think we can say we territorialize because we need to, and we need to territorialize because we have to confront chaos, both in its originary form and in its form as black holes. The territory transforms not only the elements constituting it, but its inhabitants as well, as both the territory's creator and primary beneficiary. We not only act differently in our territory from the way we act outside it, and we effectively are different and we derive a specific surface value from being this way. For example, the feeling of comfort we experience in our home is a surplus value of the specific kind of territory we call home, and not merely an affordance derived from the material circumstances of our accommodation. I do not mean to deny the importance of affordance, a concept that is lately very fashionable indeed, but I do insist that it is a secondary consideration. We have to be wary of turning affordances into efficient causes. We adapt our sense of homeliness to fit our circumstances and not the other way around, which is why a hovel can be homely and a mansion unhomely. To feel at home is not the same thing as being at home, and the difference between the two is not simply a matter of affect. This does not mean, however, that territories are optional or incidental to our lives. On the contrary, as Deleuze and Guattari conceive it, territory is not something we can do without. Our whole lives are spent building, enlarging, escaping, remodeling, or leaving our territories. Life is a constant, ongoing process of territorializing. As such, it should be clear by now, I hope, that territory is neither a spatial concept nor a material concept. This does not mean that it does not entail either spatial or material components, but it is to say that in Deleuze and Guattari's work, these aspects of the concept of territory are not considered primary. Counterintuitively, I guess, Deleuze and Guattari argue that material components are not used to create a territory. Rather, it is the territorializing process, or the T factor, as Deleuze and Guattari put it, which transforms materials into signs and thereby paves the way to the production of territory. Similarly, the space of the territory cannot easily be mapped or correlated with the proverbial facts on the ground. In many cases, the territory has no specific spatial dimension. It is all in our heads, and it is better understood as a feeling, or better yet, a sense of purpose. Rather than regard them as spaces, it would be more useful and accurate to see territories as subjective states in a psychological sense, which is how the ethologist Jakob von Uskul, one of the key theorists from whom Deleuze and Guattari lifted the concept of territory, suggests we should see them. For Deleuze and Guattari, territory is essentially a pragmatic concept. Ethology, in their view, would be better served if it paid more attention to pragmatics. Territorializing, then, is world making. Black holes are the unmaking of worlds, and it is in this sense that it is appropriately understood as a form of pragmatics. Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, and I look forward to seeing you all in the not too distant future. Please stay well and stay in touch. With thanks.